Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Oral history preserves the past by recording people's real voices. It's not just about recording the stories that people share. It's also about the way they tell those stories. Oral history is about memory and humanity. It's a form of history that anyone can be part of. Mary Romney Schaub is one person preserving history through oral histories. She recorded interviews with her father about his experience living in a Nazi concentration camp.
We were liberated in 1945, 10th of May.
10th of May?
1945. About a couple of days before Hitler died.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with two Connecticut residents about the stories they preserve through oral history. Later in the show, we'll learn about the history of Connecticut's Puerto Rican communities. But up first, Mary Romney Schaub is a retired educator and author of An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era, From Papiamentu to German. The book details her father's life, including what he went through during World War II. Mary, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here. I really appreciate it.
We are honored to have you with us to talk about your father's experience and his journey, to talk about your process in writing this book and telling this story that is often not just overlooked, but totally unrecognized. I want to start with learning about your father, Lionel Romney. Tell us what he was like.
Well, I'd like to start by giving a little bit of background. He was from the Dutch side of the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean. He was born in 1912 and he passed in 2004. He was a very, very quiet person. I always wondered why. Growing up, he wasn't quite like the other fathers who were much more sociable. And I think that now I understand that he didn't want to become very close to a lot of people because he didn't want any questions about his past, because he did not want to talk about his concentration camp experience. He didn't want to talk about his World War II experience. And of course, when you become close friends with someone, they ask you questions about your past and they expect you to talk about your past. I mean, that's natural, but he really resisted that. And I think that that's why.
I think many people have that experience, particularly those who returned from war or have had some kind of military engagement. That distance is in some ways an act of self-preservation, but it's also how you tell the story of that experience in a way that others understand when it is so deeply personal. And yet I have to ask you this very direct question. How did your father end up in a concentration camp during World War II?
He was working on cargo ships sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe. And in June 1940, he was aboard a Greek merchant ship called the SS Makis. And when the ship entered the Mediterranean and arrived at the area between Tunisia and Sicily, it struck a floating mine. And when it struck the mine, it sank. But the crew of my father's ship was rescued by a ship from the Italian Navy. And the point at which he was rescued by the Italian Navy is the point at which he became a political prisoner in Italy. Because, of course, by 1940, the war had started and Italy had entered the war. So for the next 4 years, from 1940 to 1944, he was transferred through a series of internment camps in Italy. And in June 1944, he was deported from an area near northern Italy to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. And he remained a prisoner there for almost a year, from June 1944 to May 5th, 1945, when the camp was liberated by the U.S. Army.
There's so many things that come to mind as I'm listening to you. You are a beautiful storyteller because you've painted this image of what it may have meant for your father to be sailing through these spaces, to come into contact, to survive hitting a mine, and then to end up in a concentration camp after a series of imprisonments as well. When did you learn about your father's story and his journey? Because I imagine with all the layers of that pain that he experienced, it isn't the thing that you necessarily tell your young child. When did you come to know your father's story and his place really in history?
Well, I guess it starts with a little bit about trauma. I've come to feel that silence is the voice of trauma, or silence is one voice of trauma. And that was certainly the case with my father. He was practically silent about his experience in the war for over 40 years. But I knew that something must have happened because you know how children are very curious about their parents' past, and they always want to know about their parents' lives before they were born, etc. So I used to ask my father, and he would talk about his early life in St. Martin, which is where he was from. And then he would talk about his life when he first came to New York in the late 40s. And as the years went on, I began to notice that there was a gap. And I realized that the gap was World War II. And I asked him about it, but he wouldn't say anything about it. And over a period of more than 20 years, I asked him, but it was not until we recorded our oral history that the full story really emerged. So you could say really over 40 years after he had experienced it is when I learned about the breadth and depth of what had happened to him.
Were you ever in, what kind of danger would you say you were in during that time?
Oh, every day was dangerous. There wasn't a day that wasn't, consider. Sometimes you said, so how the hell they gonna get out of here?
How were you able to get your father to open up about this trauma, this deep-seated, unspoken trauma that I imagine he wrestled with throughout those 40 years? Was it a particular moment or a buildup? How were you able to get him to be open?
That's an excellent question to which I wish I knew the answer. I have no idea why he opened up when he did, but I think that I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and he said, well, perhaps it was the presence of the camera, which is an impartial observer. The camera will not judge you. The camera will not ask any questions that you don't want to answer. Also, there was someone there operating the camera. This was back in the late 80s when that kind of equipment was very expensive, and I couldn't afford it. So I didn't have my own video camera, et cetera. So someone came and recorded that first oral history for us. So I think maybe the presence of a stranger, but I did sort of paint him into a corner. I said, well, so where were you when the war ended? And he was in a camp. He was in that concentration camp when it ended. So he did feel the need to say that. And that is when the story opened up and he began to talk about it. And that was at the very end of 1989.
Where were you when the war ended?
I was in the camp in Austria.
In Austria, not in Germany.
No, in Germany, in Austria.
In
we
Austria.
came in from Italy. They took us to Austria.
By train.
Yeah, cattle car, what the hell you call it?
A cattle car.
Yeah, cattle car.
And where in Austria?
was up in the place is near to Graz, but in a concentration camp, one of those notorious concentration camps, Mauthausen. It's up on a hill. They had a crematorium.
You know, I am someone who is a lover of history, a perpetual student of history. I like to think of myself that way. And I am ashamed to admit that it wasn't until I encountered your book that I really thought about there were Black people who had these experiences within concentration camps. And it was mind-blowing because it was one of those things of, yes, we want to know why, but also, are there others? Are there other stories that we may not know that intersect with your father's story? How common was it that Black people were in concentration camps during this time?
It was not very common at all. It was really very uncommon. Of the millions and millions of people interned in those camps, and approximately 11 million people killed in those concentration camps, I've read that there were about 50,000 Black victims. The number of Black victims is almost, well, it is, I was going to say almost impossible, but it's absolutely impossible to calculate. One reason for that is that Black people were not specifically targeted by the Nazis. That does not mean that Black people did not suffer the abuse and torture and murder of the concentration camps, because thousands of them did. My father was obviously one of them, but Black people were not specifically targeted by the Nazis. So the record keeping was not as meticulous as it was for the specifically targeted groups, especially the Jews, and then the other specifically targeted groups. I feel that Black people were not specifically targeted by the Nazis because at the beginning of the war, there were only about 25,000 of them living in Germany out of a total population of 70 million. And that Black population was not a community. It was very, very diverse. It consisted of African Americans, Africans, Afro-Europeans, Afro-Germans. So without even a common language, it was not a community. Plus, it was very widely dispersed over the entire country of Germany. So that Black population did not exert any political, cultural, or economic influence over Germany. So I feel that the Nazis just were not, they didn't feel threatened by the Black population as they did by other populations, even though they considered Black people to be subhuman. I think that the Nazis felt that they were going to win the war for a very long time. And I think that they believed that once they won the war, it would be very easy to annihilate the Black people. The Black population would be very, very easy to eliminate because they were trying to create a racially pure Aryan empire. So that means that they would have had to annihilate the Black people who were not only considered subhuman, but who were obviously not Aryan.
Coming up, more with Mary Romney Schaub on her father's experience in a Nazi concentration camp. She'll tell us about the time that her father visited the United States during segregation and sat in the front of the bus. And later, a Yale PhD student talks about why she was surprised to learn how far back the history of Puerto Rican communities in Connecticut actually goes. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're learning about people in Connecticut recording oral histories. We've been talking with Mary Romney Schaub, author of An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era, From Papiamentu to German. The book details her father's experiences in a Nazi concentration camp, and it includes excerpts from the oral history interviews that Mary recorded with her father. After Mary's father passed away, she visited Mauthausen, It's the infamous concentration camp where her father was imprisoned for part of World War II. I asked Mary what that experience was like for her.
Um, it was life-changing, but I I would just like to explain that it's an extraordinary museum. It's one of the best museums I've ever visited. Every effort has been made to preserve the camp as it was when it was in use, while acknowledging and respecting the memory of those who perished there. And every detail is meticulously explained. What the prisoners experienced is meticulously explained, and it's really it's a place that has the potential to be the site of enormous learning. But visiting it was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. And it encompassed the full spectrum of emotions from terrifying to gratifying. And on the first day that we visited, I was so terrified. I was petrified with fear of entering the camp. And I don't know why. I don't know what I was afraid of, but I was convinced that if I entered that camp, I would be devoured. And I have no idea why what I was afraid of, why I was afraid, but I was terrified. That was really an excruciating experience for me to try to enter that camp the first time. But once I was finally able to force myself to enter the camp, I was suddenly relieved of all that anxiety and fear. And I wanted to see everything. I wanted to see all the exhibits. I wanted to learn everything about everything that was in the camp. And we spent all day, every day there for about 10 days. And still, I felt that it wasn't enough. I mean, it's just a huge area with an awful lot to see. And I feel that since that first visit to Mauthausen, I've been at peace with my father's experience there because I felt that it gave me a chance to walk in his footsteps and share his pain in a way that I could not do without visiting the camp.
What you have just laid out for us is that there's a difference between being a teller of history and being a witness to history. Stephanie Fu talks about this concept of bone memory, where our bones remember the experiences of our ancestors, whether it's pain and trauma or joy and connection, it is a part of who we are. And so that feeling that you had of stepping into the space where your father had been for so many years, and to be able to walk away from it, feeling like I have an understanding, I have a sense of peace, and to find peace in a place where it was denied. And I think, Mary, about where we are, not just as a country, but really as a global community where people are denying the horrors of the Holocaust, where people are denying opportunities to learn about history and to be informed by it because they say it's too painful. And for you to be able to go to the place where your father experienced such pain and leave with connection and peace is why I think you telling this story is so powerful and why it is so needed in these moments.
I appreciate that. I mean, we're at a very challenging moment in our history, not only in this country, but throughout many areas of the world where historical denial is, I think, really having a very deleterious effect on societies everywhere. And I feel that Black history has been systematically omitted from the historical narrative, the mainstream historical narrative, at least in this country, and I think in other areas of the world as well. But that systematic exclusion of Black history from the mainstream really makes Black people invisible. And that's very destructive because it denies a lot of the contributions that we've made. But I feel that oral history gives us a way of, it provides counter narrative, and it gives us a way to reclaim a lot of the history that's been lost and omitted from the history books.
You talk in the book about your father's visit to the South in the United States, that experience of riding in the front of the bus during a period of legalized Jim Crow segregation. Talk to us about that story and what it meant for your understanding.
That took place in the 1930s when Black people lived in constant fear, intimidation, and had no legal recourse to protect themselves against the injustices that they were experiencing. But my father, being from the Caribbean, did not come from that kind of an environment. So he and the colleagues that he was with, who are also from the Caribbean, really had no idea what segregation was. They had never experienced racial oppression. So they were, I think they were in Mobile, Alabama, and they got on a bus, and the bus was empty. So they sat wherever they wanted. So they just happened to sit in the front of the bus. And the bus driver looked at them, he glared at them, and they couldn't understand why. So as the bus moved along, but my father told me that he thinks that the bus driver understood that they were foreigners because of the way they were dressed and because of their accents. So the bus driver could tell that they weren't local Black people. So maybe that's why he didn't do anything. But as other Black people got on the bus, as the bus moved along its route and other Black people got on the bus, they did talk to my father and his colleagues and say, well, it's not the custom here, and we could all get in a lot of trouble if you stay here at the front. So if you could please move to the back, it would just be better for us. But my father just couldn't understand that. And when I heard him say that, when he was telling me that story, and I heard him say that, I was incredulous. I said, "You sat in the front of the bus? Oh my goodness, how could you do that?" And that was when he explained that they didn't know anything about racial segregation, and they had never experienced it.
I am curious about what this journey of writing this book during the oral history, the writing process, what did this teach you about yourself?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. I think it taught me that I needed to penetrate to the source. I really enjoyed those oral history interviews that I had with my father. Everything he said was so evocative. I really I felt that I was in the situation with him as I was listening to him. But when he passed away and I no longer had him as the source of that information, I felt that I had to go to the other source, which was Mauthausen itself. So I think, my capacity for confronting historical truth and difficult histories, challenging histories, painful histories, I think, is one thing I learned about myself. But I learned a lot about him. I felt that for the first time, I really knew my father. I was getting to know my father in depth in a way that I never had before.
I hope you also learned that you are a gifted teacher, historian, and storyteller for building this connection for us to always honor those past experiences, but to also think about the connection we have now. Mary Romney Schaub is a retired educator and author of An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era, From Papiamentu to German. The book details her father's experiences in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. Mary, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been a great honor. Thank you so much.
Coming up, we'll hear how a PhD student at Yale is working to preserve stories that reflect the complexity and the nuance of Connecticut's Puerto Rican communities. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with people in Connecticut who are preserving the past through oral history. One of the strengths of oral histories is that they give everyday people the chance to tell their stories. It highlights people who might otherwise be overlooked in history books. Amanda Rivera is using oral histories to make sure that Puerto Rican voices are part of the historical record. Amanda is a PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies at Yale University. Her work explores activism and education reform in Puerto Rican communities across Southern Connecticut. Amanda, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, we were talking a little bit before we started our formal conversation about the fact that you are a PhD candidate in American Studies and the many ways that people do and do not understand what that means.
Yeah.
Share with us a little bit about you and your background that led you into this field of study.
So my parents are actually now going back to school, but they did not finish college. I had an aunt, my titi, Charlene, who is about a decade older than me, so was more like an older sister. And she went to college when I was a kid, and she went to school near me where I lived in New Jersey. She went to Rutgers University. So seeing her go through that, like I wanted to be Charlene. And then she went to get her PhD, and I was like, oh, wait, you could keep going to school? Like, that's possible? Like, you can just keep learning. You could be a professor? And seeing that really inspired me. And so I think from an early age, I always knew I wanted to learn, I wanted to teach. And then especially I'm like third-ish generation Puerto Rican. There's a lot of back and forth migration. There's a lot of gaps even just in my own knowledge. And so much of what my family had to go through was just trying to survive, trying to assimilate as best they could. My mother grew up in the South Bronx, my father in Brooklyn. So much of their understanding of Puerto Ricanness was just about, we just got to survive. And we just got to get the kids out of the toxicity and into, for them, it was into New Jersey. So I also felt like I had a lot of gaps in even understanding like my own Puerto Ricanness and what does that mean to me? And so hence the very long journey of how I got here.
Well, I'm glad that you sketched that journey for us, because I think people often assume a scholar just sort of falls from the sky and has these ways of thinking and being. And what you've outlined is that you had this inspiration of your Titi and watching her journey, but also understanding that you had within you this passion to know, to understand, to share that understanding, as well as having a better sense of you, your family, and the communities to which you are connected. And I want to talk about the ways that your scholarship is opening up those ways of understanding, those storytelling, so that, yes, it is the stories of individual families and individual people, but more than that, it is collectively the stories of families, of neighborhoods, of communities. And I will say, as someone who's not born in Connecticut, who's not from the Northeast, I had this perception of Connecticut being very homogenous, very rich, very white.
Yes.
And then when I was thinking about moving here, it was, oh, wait, there's this vibrant, thriving Puerto Rican community. There are people who have come from the American South and the global South all over and created community here. Tell us a little about the Puerto Rican community here in Connecticut and that connection for your work.
Yeah. So very similarly, I grew up in New Jersey. So I assumed, like you did, that Connecticut would be just rich white people.
Right.
Particularly Yale. I thought, like, all right. I noticed there were people of color within my department, but I just kind of assumed, like, okay, it's just this little one pocket, and then that's it. And then I got here, and my advisor, Ana Ramos Ayas, she attended Yale as an undergrad. And she's like, oh, I was part of this organization called Despierta Boricua. And it was a Puerto Rican student activist organization at Yale. And actually, like, we just celebrated like our 50th year at the university. And we found these archives in the cultural center in La Casa Cultural Julia de Burgos, which is named after this incredible Afro-Boricua poet named Julia de Burgos, in one of the only buildings on campus named after a woman of color. And Anna had told me, like, okay, you need to be in my seminar, and we're going to be processing these archives of these Puerto Rican students who have like a 50-year history. Now, granted, like I was like, what you mean we've been here for 50 years? Like, what? I had no idea. Here I am stupidly thinking, like, okay, we didn't get here till like, a couple years ago. But actually, like, finding out La Casa Cultural was founded by Boricua students who went to then President Brewster and were inspired by Black student activism on campus. And we're like, hey, okay, so BSAY was able to secure the house, which is now on Park. It's had a few locations, but okay, so they secured the house. Okay, now we need a house. We need a cultural center. And they had always created it with the intention of it being public facing. They'd always wanted it to be a part of the Boricua community. So I, started off with school as my entryway because I am a nerd. And, I've always been inspired by student activists who have used their education to challenge institutions and challenge the norm, challenge the status quo, particularly Puerto Ricans. So that was sort of my entryway to understanding the Puerto Rican communities that were in Connecticut. And then from there, I started branching off a bit. In summer 2023, I started an oral history archive with both Bridgeport and New Haven. My dissertation right now focuses more on New Haven, but I was also looking at Bridgeport at one point. And I just wanted to get a sense of, like, okay, like, what do you mean we've been here? Like, I thought Connecticut was white. Like, what do you mean we've been here for decades? And what did that look like? And, the Puerto Rican Connecticut diaspora is one of, like, the later ones. So a lot of us, I mean, there are folks who, Ruth Glasser actually wrote a book in 1997. And to my knowledge, it's one of the few books about just sort of Puerto Rican diaspora in Connecticut. There's only a handful. But she found archives as early as like the late 1800s of like a Puerto Rican family that lived here in New Haven. So like we've always been here.
And that idea of we've always been here is critical in so many dimensions. But it also means, Amanda, it's critical to understand who tells the story of being here. I know this is almost like asking someone a favorite pet or favorite child or favorite flavor of ice cream. But is there an interview or story in those oral histories that you've been a part of that stands out to you of this is the beauty and magnitude of the Puerto Rican experience here in Connecticut?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Because people have just been so generous with their time and with their stories. Okay, so I did one at Yale. So as part of this seminar with my advisor, we did oral histories of alumni. And I got to speak with someone whose father migrated here from Gurabo, Puerto Rico, to Bridgeport. He was specifically recruited by the migrant division to come teach bilingual ed, to help lead bilingual ed here in Connecticut. Initially, they wanted him to go to Hartford, and then he said, because I was also able to interview him, which was great. He was like, yeah, Hartford wanted me, but then Bridgeport came and poached me out. So getting to speak with his daughter and then also with him separately to understand her perspective of she identifies as a bicultural Puerto Rican, which is a lot of us, where at least for her, she spent the first 10 years of her life in Puerto Rico before moving here. For a lot of us, we didn't have as much time in Puerto Rico, or maybe we did, but we came here quite early. And so it's this divide that we feel of not being quite enough on the island. We're regarded as well, tú eres de pa allá. You're from pa fuera. You're from out there. You left. But then we come here stateside and we're not American enough because Puerto Rico is an American colony, because we are second-class citizens. And so we're sort of trapped in this sort of nether space. And getting to talk with her a bit about biculturality, ways that she even mobilized on campus to try to get Puerto Rican coursework on the table. She was able to coordinate a couple seminars that were taught that wound up even influencing her own senior thesis. And then another great oral history I was able to do, I got to sit down with a community member who they've lived in the Hill since 1959. They still have the family house.
And the Hill is a neighborhood in New Haven.
Yes.
Just for our listeners who may not know.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So the Hill and Fairhaven historically have been the neighborhoods that Puerto Ricans have moved to. The Hill being predominantly Black and Puerto Rican, and Fairhaven being predominant, initially sort of ethnic white and Puerto Rican, and now it's just sort of more broadly Latine. But I got to sit down with her in her childhood home and ask her about her life, both migrating over here stateside and also just hearing about her life as an educator. She'd had multiple decades as an educator, taught at first, and then transitioned into administrative work into becoming an assistant principal. And it was great to hear even just the complexities. So something that I think as Puerto Ricans that we get very anxious to talk about is race. We just think oh, well, we have all three. We are white and indigenous and Black, and therefore there cannot be racism. But really having to contend with nope, there's colorism, there's anti-Blackness, there is anti-indigeneity. It's challenging to have. I think younger generations are much more ready to have those conversations, whereas older gens are oh, but we don't think like that. And I'm you do.
Right.
You just talk about it a little different. It was even just fascinating to hear her family initially, because they could pass as white, they didn't quite face the same discrimination I had assumed that they would, because they could more or less blend in with the other Italian families and with the other ethnic white families. And then later on, though, in her academic career, she gets pushed back both from islanders who feel like you're not Puerto Rican enough to be able to teach the Spanish portion of this bilingual class, and then pushed back from Americans who are oh, well, you're Puerto Rican, so just teach bilingual ed. So I think just fleshing out those nuances means a lot to me. These sort of complexities of our experiences, that they aren't quite as straightforward. That it's this mixture of privilege and oppression, and getting to really flesh out those nuances, I think means a lot to me in getting to do these oral histories. And also just producing a record for people to use well after I'm done with the dissertation. I don't want this research to just stay with me. And so getting to create something that can live after me, that other people can add to or use as they may.
We're in a moment, an era, if you will, Amanda, where there are dogged attacks, not just attempts, but successful attacks on telling history in its fullness, telling it in its fullness, in its messiness, in its complexity, and not sugarcoating the challenges that people face to just be themselves, of being told you're too much of this and not enough of this. And when we think generationally about elders who are passing on or no longer able to share their stories, it becomes even more important to have oral histories as this multi-generational way of sharing knowledge and experience. And you are doing that while connecting to others who have done that before you. I am curious about how this work, or if this work, has taught you anything about yourself, about who you are or your family. How is the work that you're doing helping that sort of self-realization?
Yeah. So one of my ultimate confidants, and just talking about my research, trying to make sense of my thoughts, is my mom. And just talking with her about, okay, these are the challenges, or this is what I'm trying to get across. And she's more or less like a barometer for me, where if something's not making sense to her, then I'm like, all right, let's reevaluate. Because again, I do this for me to learn, but I do this for my family. I do this so that they have access to institutions like this. So they have access to their stories. So much of growing up in the American mainland is suppressing yourself, is squashing any sort of difference, is trying to blend in. I am more white presenting, and it took me so long to really understand that my Puerto Ricanness is nuanced and that that's okay, that there's no one way to be Puerto Rican, that Puerto Ricanidad is beautiful and messy and deeply complicated. And it is still something that I can claim, even though I am third generation. Even if my Spanish is, we have a phrase, mi español es matado, which means my Spanish is murdered. I've been given these privileges for whatever reason. I think God is still trying to show me what that is. But I need to use them to create access for other people. It bothers me that, my parents walk around feeling like, okay, well, Amanda's oh, I don't really understand what you're doing, but you sound so smart, so you just go for it. I'm like, no, this is for you too. And we forget that our first professors, our first instructors are our elders, are our parents, are our grandparents. My parents were able to explain, especially from their context growing up in the South Bronx and in Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s, are able to speak so much more powerfully about class and race and power dynamics, probably than most scholars would be able to, at least in terms of explain it in a way that's actually, you can actually understand it and it's not just full of a bunch of jargon. Yeah. So I think it's just taught me so much about okay, am I making this research accessible? Am I just doing this simply for the academy, which, as I explained earlier, would love nothing more than to chew me up and spit me out, particularly in this moment? Or am I going to do this out of love? Am I going to do this out of love for my people, out of love for future generations, so they're not walking around with this shame and with these gaps, but can take pride in our stories and also be frustrated with our stories, because some of them are frustrating, but taking us in all our nuances, all our complications.
I love what you said, that our first professors are our parents. Because sometimes in our present thinking, it is difficult for us to understand the choices that they had to make or the limited options that they had. And they did the best that they could with what they had. And often we look back in this revisionist way to say, oh, I wouldn't have done that. Or why did you make that decision to not object when people thought, oh, you're white passing enough, and to not shout from the rafters, this is my identity. Yeah. And that sort of generational understanding and humility can also mean that when we start telling those stories, sometimes it makes people uncomfortable to say, wait, that's family business. We don't tell that. We don't talk about that in mixed companies, so to speak. And I know from my own experience, my own family history, that can also be a challenge of, you mentioned having this opportunity. How do you leverage that opportunity while being mindful of and respectful of those who say, please don't talk about this outside of Puerto Rican communities or outside of families, because there's a history of how that's been used against? How do you navigate that as a scholar, not just as a person who is deeply affected by those histories, but as a scholar, how do you navigate that tension of, we need to tell the stories, and sometimes the stories are difficult?
Yeah, that's always a challenge. Something that I try to posit is like, hey, just please share with me whatever you're comfortable sharing. There was at least one oral history where someone was like, wait, can we pause for a second? And I was like, sure. And she's like, okay, I'm going to explain this, but like I only want this part in. I was like, all right, cool. And that's how we did it. And, you know, there just were aspects of her story that like she didn't want out there. And because so much is demanded of us and so much is expected of us, I'm not going to sit here and be like, well, but the record, you know, like at the end of the day, like I need to respect people's agency, and I need to respect that there are just some stories that won't be told. Even in my own life, unfortunately in January, my great grandmother passed away. She was 85, Miriam Crespo, incredible woman. Married at 14, divorced by 21, moved to the garment district in New York with her aunt, and worked in New York City sweatshops in the garment district, and would send money home to her daughters, to my grandmother and her sisters. Before she passed, I really did want to do an oral history with her, just to ask her, just because so much of that life is so radical, of her having to make such hard choices for herself, for her daughters. But my mom was like, I don't know. She's probably not going to want to talk about this. And, you know, she passed away before I really had a chance to bring it up. But my mom was like, yeah, like, I don't think she would have wanted to talk about this. And frankly, like, because so much of her life was out of her control, because she was told, go marry this 20-something-year-old at the age of 14, because she had to choose to end the marriage. He had alcoholism. So much of her life was almost like sort of predetermined for her. I was like, okay, well, the least I can do is respect her agency and decide that, like, okay, she doesn't want to do that oral history. She doesn't want to tell those stories.
I appreciate you for reminding us about that agency, that as much as we want to know, as much as we think it's important to know to help fill in the gaps or get a better sense, that especially for those who have been denied agency throughout their lives, throughout their experience, being able to determine what they share and when is really an affirmation of the connection and a way to think about how we use the opportunities right in front of us to leave, as you said, that legacy for the next generation to come and negotiate. Amanda Rivera is PhD candidate in American Studies at Yale University. Her work explores activism and education reform in Puerto Rican communities in Southern Connecticut. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me.
This episode of Disrupted was produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.